for us, this installation has the sense of initiate ourselves to a new era, and maybe a new sensitivity, a new awareness, and then in this case, actually, we are able eventually to redefine how we want to live. So the cities in which we want to live, the spaces in which we want to live. And actually, this installation is made of 4 steps, and the first step is about like deconditioning ourselves through workouts. Let's say how to rebuild the muscles of a collective body, because we are not used anymore to be together. We have been separated from each other. We already were very individualistic before, but I think with the COVID we have become like very lonely. And so the idea is much more to use, for example, to redefine a space, a body language, and just decondition ourselves from this idea that the maximization of capital and profit is the one that defines the cities. Actually, what defines a city is like our work together, our knowledge, scientific knowledge or like popular knowledge together, our resources, like our sharing, and then actually by transforming ourselves, we can transform the way we used to live in a different one. And we don't know what it will be, so that's why what it will be, like how we're going to live together and so on. And the second step instead is also a sort of graphics or illustration of our methodology, but I think what we think it would be important to do is just to this coalition of 2 different kinds of knowledge. One is the radical scientific knowledge, and the other one rather academic, but progressive, let's say, but the other one is also the knowledge of the daily life. So the knowledge of our way of living, the popular knowledge, the knowledge of the activists, the knowledge of the people that live every day and they fight for a better future, let's say. The third step instead is also a way actually to redefine or how we see and study, for example, the city, which for us, or we give this name, is like a unitary way of understanding. Let's say that to redefine, for example, a way of living in the cities, we need actually to really put together, through different, or put together different disciplines, and actually not creating any more borders between them. So architecture could get along with geography, with knitting, with different kind of knowledges of any type. And I think actually by putting them together, we can have a more understanding of the city instead of having these compartments, in defining. And also to be transversal, most of the time, in order really to cross this kind of knowledge to create different kind of relationships. And the fourth step is also to steer up a new kind of imagination that is given by the flags. In the flags, actually, there are sentences that we took from activists, from people that we encountered, that actually gave us insight into the city or gave us an inspiration. And they are, of course, eyes from in the sky, let's say, because actually when we look at an imaginary, for example, we go beyond our present obstacles, let's say. So through this, of course, we play with it. It's not, we don't take ourselves serious. But actually for us, it was like a playground in which you pass through an initiation, and then in the end, eventually, by re-educating yourself, by redefining yourself, you can redefine also the way you live. And so you can have the perspective of, but you can find out when you go on a visit. So these are, for example, the mirrors in which you can make your exercise in order to define the collective body and strengthen your muscles for the next future to come. And then I just would like to show some of the projects that we did internationally. For example, this one is one of the last ones that was in Philadelphia, in which we occupied a vacant lot. So the situation is complicated. It was a private space, but then by inviting the people of the neighborhood and other people, it became an inhabited space, more public, of course. And there we redefined the way we wanted to live in the neighborhood and other issues. And it ended up I can show in a reappropriation of the public space, which was like a park next to it that was not really in good condition. There were like people gambling or criminalities there, and the families and the association decided that they wanted it back, and actually we that facilitated only helped in a way to realize this moment. It was the first festival in which all the neighbors participated, in which actually they stated their will to retransform the space as theirs, and actually now the space is really physically transformed because they renovated it the way they wanted. So another project we did in the south of Italy that was called the Urban Campaign, and it was a way actually to give voice to the people that usually are not listened to, heard of. And so the idea was like really to manifest many times in the streets and to use the typical flags that usually politicians use or like the parties, political parties uses to manifest their propaganda and so on. And being in the street and say like just what you really need to say, like being very, very visible. And we occupied also a public fountain there, and every day we were there actually to really disclose the stories of the people and so on, like to be there more and more, and like just to come out, you know, like to come out and not to be inside all the time, but really to be visible, to manifest, to be present. And one other project is just also in Milan, and this was a tipi that we created with flags, again the flags, but actually that we created together with the people, and they represent different people in the neighborhood there. And actually after a parade, we came there and we used this tipi as a sort of like human or like temporary monument in order actually to make space for the neighborhood. A neighborhood that was like a dormitory, where actually there is no service, nothing, neglected from the center of the city, in which actually we started our monument to a new way of living, to a new republic that we imagined, let's say, with new rules made by the inhabitants, by the people. I don't tell you everything, this is too like much. And then actually this is, I end with this photo that is really funny, but it was like a project, it was an exchange between like different artists internationally. But it's funny for me because it's like something funny happening in this space. But actually for me it reminds me of this quote of Bertolt Brecht that says, when something seems the most obvious thing in the world, it means that any attempt to understand the world has been given up. So actually even a gesture like that maybe now, because we're used to everything actually is seen as obvious and doesn't really, we don't focus on it anymore and so on. But then I think actually we are too much used to what is happening now in the world, and then we should instead like focus on it again and really put our attention and our, in a way, resources there really to redefine what we want.
Great, thank you. Do you have a question you want to ask everyone on the panel?
How would you I was actually thinking before, like about your questions about like how you could eventually redefine the space, and then I was thinking about like that maybe you can start to like really with the chaos in a way in the space in order to invite people to redefine. But what would you think actually if people will start messing around with your space and actually not, you know, like redefining the space that you defined before?
Would love that. Yeah, I think that's like the most successful parts of the city, are when you have places that have been designed on some framework for people just to take over on their own terms. And so like one of my favourite places in London is on the South Bank, and it's sort of the undercroft of a building that's been completely taken over by skateboarders and graffiti artists. And it's just incredible. It sort of becomes the stage of everyone watching the skateboarders and people just using steps and stuff skateboarding. And a few years ago they were going to try and sort of move all the skateboarders on, and there was this huge protest actually to allow them to stay. And I just think those are the parts of the cities which are like the most successful, and are the parts that no one could imagine how they were going to transform and what they would become. And I think with our pavilion, we've always intended for each of the spaces to kind of suggest ways that people can use them, but are sort of open to interpretation. Part of what we wanted to do was take the opportunity to see how different visitors would actually interact with these installations and what they would start to do with them in a way that we never could have kind of predicted.
I think it's a similarity across a lot of the exhibitions, though, that they pose more questions than they give necessarily like solutions. And I think that for us, we saw, as Mandy was saying, we saw the exhibition as like a way to test these ideas, but also to learn from how people interact with these spaces. And you know, it took us a while to actually be able to come here, but it was really interesting even yesterday to see people use the spaces in ways we never even expected or imagined. And so I think that that's the success of a space is maybe when people are encouraged to do things that you never even thought they would do then. I don't know what you guys think.
I think what you're raising is also the question of how open spaces can actually be, and to whom spaces are actually open. And I think it's one of the probably most important lessons that we've learned when working on our own pavilion, that with the extension of spaces and the use of hybrid spaces these days, that we are becoming more and more uncertain about what kind of publics we are going to deal with. So the question of open space is really state, but also the question of what kind of publics we have in mind when we're working on a particular space as designers, as architects, as planners, and so on. And rather than thinking about the space as an abstract entity that can be used by just anybody, I think what we should do as designers should think of particular groups that are marginalized in societies for whom we should provide more spaces. I think one of the great achievements of this edition of the Biennale is that we have already many different installations, also including your wonderful pavilions installation, that it has opened up spaces that reflect the use of urban conditions or rural conditions by the many, not the few. And there's a wonderful term that two urban scholars, up to Malik Simoni and Dijan Dirao, have coined when they write about urban majorities. What they say is that we've forgotten urban majorities to an extent that we think that we're just catering for anybody. But if in fact we are marginalizing so many people, so many parts of populations, by thinking about designs that we aim to be open for everybody, but they have a particular character, they have particular aesthetics, a feel to it, a haptic, a visual aura that caters for some and doesn't cater for others. So we should really think designs in terms of how we can include those people who are not reached by design, and think of these urban majorities. If we consider what the open character of architecture is about.
And thank you. Well, I would add to that it's actually an extremely tricky question about what would happen if people would just start messing around. And I think we've probably many of us had the experience, like on public transport, is that it becomes can become very quickly very awkward when this term that's often used, this jargon of public space, needs to be negotiated, or the use of, and people should just negotiate the use of public space on their own terms. That's very close, it often borders on who's the most violent, and simple things like manspreading, all that. We don't are particularly keen on that, I suppose. So what I've been really impressed with actually in terms of your work, Lucia, and I have to make a disclaimer, I'm a long-standing fan, like going decades back. And what I've been always found really impressive is the way how you've employed design and architecture and artistic interventions as another agent to help us negotiate that. And I remember many instances where situations became very contested, and conflicts actually emerged through providing space, and suddenly conflicts that were latent, but suddenly broke out. And how, in a very modest way, your design interventions helped to provide a separate ground for these conflicts to be negotiated. I think that's really the challenge for how architecture can be introduced here as an agent to help moderate these negotiations so that we don't end up with this Wild West situation where it's purely about who's the most bullish and who can claim space for themselves.
Yeah, well, I agree. And actually, what I'm about to present probably would, answering.
So maybe we
Perfect,
just
perfect segue. Oh, there's it. I'm glad I'm not the only one with this issue.
So here we go. Okay. So I'll be presenting the Peruvian Pavilion, playground artifacts for interaction. We respond to the prompt, how we will live together, with an action, reflection, by using a local problem to take on a global challenge. The project aimed to remove gates and fences from public spaces in various districts of the capital and of Peru, and transform them into artifacts inviting people to interact. Peru is still recovering from the scars of an internal conflict that raged from 1980 to 2000s. The people of Lima started gating their streets as a defense mechanism. More than 20 years later, we have not stopped engaging ourselves. Like the rest of the world, faced with the persistence of the media and the precariousness of global politics and the new order that is taking shape through the pandemic, we're becoming wary of each other once again. This situation could further exacerbate the fear of the other and increase atomization. Gates reify our fears, and we need to work in ways to transform those fears into opportunities. The normalization of the use of gates is becoming part of the urban landscape and the collective unconscious. This is reflected nationally as well as internationally, especially in recent times where more gates have been installed, but we notice them less. Because of this, we need more places for integration and less exclusionary devices. It is necessary to stop and reflect on what the cost of this phenomenon is to the city and its dwellers. Public space is meant to be experienced by all citizens on equal footing. In Lima, from the most exclusive areas to the poorest of the city's areas, this situation has become invisible. Maybe it has to do with our education. Here, the top schools in Lima and their facade walls. The more exclusive the school, the taller and uglier their walls. So these security elements come segregation devices. We're turning to benches, playground games, soccer goals, and so forth in an effort to rechannel all the time, energy, and money expended into building barriers by breathing new meaning and life into the raw materials. Like this ladder and Carola, a seesaw artifact. We really like the seesaw. This game teaches how we can relate, interact with others. So the game requires two parties, and in order to start, they both needed to be leveled. Once both are in equilibrium, one will ascend or descend depending on the contract with the other, and then they'll take turns. They always depend on each other. Through balance and play, trust emerges. Trust becomes paramount in order to create harmony and a fluid interaction during the play. The game starts and finishes with both parties being leveled in order for there to be success. It's about subtle communication played out in physical form and intuition. It's a game that teaches us that we all are mirrors of one another. This ladder was part of the entry gate. The operation was only turning at 90 degrees. The artifact helped us reflect that once you climb to the top of the ladder, it's always better to have someone holding the stair so you won't fall. Here's the mock-up for the love seat artifact that we did. A pool, these corner benches, and a soccer goal. This is a little animation of the operation. It didn't happen exactly like that, but you get the idea. And also lenticular panels are attached to the entry gate, where two versions of the same photograph, with and without gates, coexist. Through the film, the gated photographs will disappear into emblematic spaces clear of them. From local physical gates, we then move on to the discussing less apparent and global ones. Here's the University Park in the center of Lima. our Peruvian Congress Plaza, the cathedral in the main plaza in Arequipa, our second largest city, the Palacio Real in Madrid. Here we can appreciate how the dynamics of the streets completely changes. The White House in the USA. And then we move into the less obvious ones, like Brexit, of course. Or in this case, the chasing of the Sea-Watch boat that rescued drowning people and was prohibited to enter to the Lampedusa port in Italy, and ended up with Carola Rackete, the captain being arrested. We named our CISO boat bench after her. Our actual ubiquitous surveillance systems that are in a different ways the new form of gates, and in that same line, we ended up with our cell phones as our ultimate gates. So the pavilion invites us to reflect on what is left inside and what is left outside, when there are gates in between. After the exhibition, the playground artifacts will be returned to their original place, modified and ready to continue transforming us. And I'll end this presentation with the movie that we prepared for the installation. Thank you. Why not finishing the presentations and then maybe we can ask.
Sure. If you guys want to talk about those people.
Most welcome to, and it's also, a perfect transition, the material that we've just saw in the last video clip that we've shown, because it really wonderfully demonstrates our own ambition to intervene in the meaning of certain terms. And so I think, the example that you've shown here of the appropriation of the material is really, it's not about shifting boundaries by moving the fence, by 10 or 5 meters, but really turning it into something else. And then it's not anymore about any fence. The fence is completely out of the picture. It's suddenly about something else. And I think it's about that intervention that shifts the parameters of the discourse that are really at stake. So I talked earlier about this idea of this kind of a vision of planting ideas through working with language and working with terms. And I want to illustrate this in connection to our theme here with 2 terms. One is commons, and the second one is property, and I'll go into detail in the last few minutes that we have. Because we are here assembled to talk about the increasing and ongoing privatization of public space. And of course, all the new communication technologies, platform urbanism at large, is extremely implicated in this. When you think about all the surveillance technology that's currently developed through all these kind of devices that we carry with us, so there are certain instances of privatization that are even not visible to us. So when a large group of people congregates in a public square, that becomes immediately apparent to those who monitor movement of people through recording devices and recording the devices that people use. And so there's a lot of privatization currently ongoing that's not tangible and not visible to us. So platform urbanism is certainly very much implicated. But as I've said, when we fight on the given terms, it's often a lost cause. So we might be able to move the fence by 5 meters. In the meantime, a concrete wall gets erected somewhere else. So what have we achieved? So I think the ambition of of us in our curatorial approach is how we can shift the parameters of the discourse and transform the meaning and connotation of certain terms. And so I was really struck by, also when I read about the commons in the British Pavilion, because that's also a very loaded term currently. And often when we think about the commons, we think of this in terms of something given, like natural resources that are given and are overexploited, or other things. But it's always about some kind of given entity that is there and where we just struggle about the use. But we could also rethink the term commons as not something given, but something that can be collectively produced. So for instance, a shared sociality that emerges through projects like the Cheers projects, that can create a commons that wasn't given there before. So commons can be something that emerge. So the second term, property, again, is one that is used most often when talking about the privatization of public space or the usage of public space. It's always along the category of property, and we don't introduce other parameters in the discussion. And again, property is often used as something or understood as something given. It's a given who owns something, and that, according to who owns it as property, that determines the discussion. So in terms of planting and working with language, those of you who have visited the Austrian Pavilion might be familiar with one of the slogans that reads, "Data is a relation, not a property," and that works precisely along these lines. And if I may just explain this a little bit again, when, as I've explained earlier, the privatization of space through surveillance, etc. So often the heated discussion then about who owns the data that is harvested from the usage, from our everyday lives. And again, this is thought along the lines of property. So it's a given characteristic that belongs either to the user and then somebody illegally or, on other terms, appropriates it by them. But it's like a given entity that we fight about. But there is a different way to think about data, not as something given, as a property, as a characteristic, but actually as a reference system that we've collectively come up with and developed over certain times that help us to navigate our lives as a community. So if you think it as a reference system, so for instance, how people congregate in public space, and then we collect the data about it, but it shows the relation, it shows the position and the distance between different people moving in space. So it's something that is co-produced, and through the act of co-production should also be perhaps understood as a collectively produced commons. So data is a commons that belongs to nobody, but to all who participate in creating that reference system. And it can be changed over time. It's not a given. So if we fight about the usage of public space and we say, no, we cannot use it because it belongs to, I don't know, some hereditary peer or somebody who has kind of inherited, and it's their property because it's recorded in a book. That's not a given characteristic. It's an artificial construct. It's a relationship that has, in a particular society, in a particular capitalist history, has been developed over time. So that can be understood differently. So if we take this on board, this intervention, and read data as a relation, as a collectively owned commons, and that needs to be collectively cared for, suddenly we can shift the whole discourse, the whole discussion. So if we all help us spreading this idea, picking up the postcards, we might even eventually get to the European Commission that they can start to think about data completely differently, not as a property, as a commodity that can be sold and traded on markets, but something that is a collective commons, a collective good that needs to be cared for collectively. So it's my contribution.
Just want to briefly pick this up and want to link this back to the project that you guys did, because I think, as Helgi said, unhinging the frameworks of operation, that is part and parcel of how we were operating in our contribution. If you think of the Peruvian example, I was really struck by these fences and the construction of the fences and how they can be redone. Because if you think of the boundary as a line, that's so wonderful how it can be transformed into an inhabitable space, into a real place. But the challenge that we're facing increasingly with hybrid formats and with when you're dealing with virtual spaces composed of zeros and ones, but how to negotiate between 0 and 1. Because the question then is not about how to make this inhabitable, but the challenge is really getting your head around the demands of access, and the challenge is how to make a virtual space accessible by paying something or whatever. And I was really struck by thinking about, for instance, about the pub that you guys have installed in the British Pavilion, because it's such a wonderful space that made me think of how one can translate this into some virtual coming together. Because even I myself, who don't really like drinking beers, I love going to pubs, and that's not because of what many people would associate a pub with, but about a certain climate that has been existing throughout so many different decades, and flexibility of space, the ability of such space is just wonderful. And I'm really struck by these examples, and the question is really how to translate the many additional spheres that we are now dealing with. That's a question for the future, though.
To quote the karaoke lyrics in that room, it's more than just a pub. I think we were really interested in how often there is a perception that the pub is sort of somewhere that you go for drinking, but actually in places around the UK where you see a really high closure of pubs, you often see an increase in alcoholism. So it sort of shows that the pub is actually more than just a place to go and drink. It's a sort of huge community place, and something that room does. Room designers have designed it so that the bar structure sort of changes in heights, which then allows everyone to come and sit around the table, no matter what their age, whether they're in a wheelchair. And I think it's really interesting, sort of these very simple design moves, what they can achieve, and that's something I found really powerful in your films and animations, where you're showing the removal of the railings around all these public spaces, and sort of showing us how sort of simple it is sort of physically to remove these railings, but actually it's a very kind of loaded political statement to do. And we were really interested in our research. We found that in World War II, a lot of the railings around garden squares were removed because the railings were sort of melted for ammunition. And in fact, what happened was you had all these garden squares that were traditionally gated, sort of open to the public for the first time. And there was lots of research out there showing these amazing kind of texts from people like George Orwell, talking about how these spaces were suddenly places that everyone from all walks of life could meet for the first time. And then, of course, after the war, the railings were reinstated, and you kind of lost that kind of gathering space that was allowed for anyone. And I suppose we're sort of really interested by both those tangible barriers, but also the kind of intangible kind of legislative policy kind of scale that we also need to be acting in as architects if we really want to create meaningful change. And when you showed that slide as well of Brexit, it's always kind of painful to remember that Brexit happened. It was very painful to suddenly have to go into a different queue in the airport and stuff at the moment, but again it just shows how it is about both these kind of very physical barriers, but also these kind of legislative and intangible barriers. And I think that's something that's sort of really interesting across all the pavilions, especially as we're going into this more kind of digital age. How do we kind of broach those kind of physical, digital? We
created as a space for marginalized groups throughout history, but they've got like a banner on one of the walls from the Joiners Arms, which was a pub that was like really appropriated by the LGBTQ community. And in many parts of the world where you can't physically gather together, that community really exists online in various forums or in kind of augmented reality spaces. And it's really, so it's kind of I think there's lots of really fascinating parallels of where the digital realm and the physical realm kind of coexist or can learn from each other. And I was just curious of all your research, like what are other spaces where that occurs?
And I suppose how we're uniquely placed as architects in our kind of world and how we're constantly acting between these different spheres.
Also, we were discussing yesterday actually in a pub that was kind of derived, so it was also in a public space, about the idea of the data, the collected data, and the possibilities of that being used as how cryptocurrency is being used. So it's just open and owned by everybody. And how would that start changing, the landscapes of data ownership and private information as well? But with that, if everybody has that information available, the data available, so it levels the game for everyone. And in a sense, going back to the manifesto, the Evolving Manifesto project, that's basically at the end the ultimate goal, that you have all the questions and everybody can, have kind of like a GIS kind of system that you go and all the data is over there, but everybody can access the data. Not owned by private companies that will sell you advertising and distort everything, but you can make your own conclusions of the data.
I think it's really interesting we're at this critical moment right now, because when you look at the history and the development of these digital technologies and their infiltration, if you will, into our everyday lives, if you remember like 10, 15 years back, this was really the realm of kind of progressive groups. And in our own research, we've spent a lot of time traveling around the world and engaging with all these new networks that were forming in the early years of the millennium, and that they're very much based on this idea that these new digital technologies can be appropriate to serve this alternative to ours, and that we could help increase democratization, and that we could also allow horizontal and hierarchical-less interactions and formation of new cultures. So one of our early publications bore the title Network Culture.